This is Uncollared, off-the-cuff conversations with progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard, Senior Pastor at Glendale City Church. My partner is Shane Kinnison at First Baptist Church of Glendale. Today our topic is church decline and pastor burnout, and we're looking at what 2020 has done to faith communities and their leaders. I hope whether you are a faith leader or somebody who cares about the status of religion in our country, that you will enjoy this conversation. All right, Shane, it's great to be back with you. We've been, you and I, we've been traveling around a little bit, doing a little vacationing. How was your time with your family? Did you have a good time?
We had a wonderful time. Thanks, Todd. We are beginning to see a little post-COVID light at the end of the tunnel. And so as a result, we were with our grandchildren for the first time in 17 months.
Wow.
And being that they're 6, 4, and 2, we have really missed them. And while we were with them, their parents announced to us that we're going to be grandparents one more time. So we have a 4th grandchild coming in November, a little girl. So thank you for asking. We had a ball. We had more fun, and we came home totally exhausted, and we're still trying to recover.
That's means you did the job. You did the grandparenting job just right. If you're exhausted and you did it just right.
Yes, and
thank God.
Thank you, and thank God for a good chiropractor.
That's pretty good. Well, between you and me, we haven't had many podcasts because of our travels, and
yes.
So I think we'll be getting back into the flow a little bit more now. And today, I think both of us, as my congregation, we just started doing a little bit of church again on our campus, and your congregation is getting ready to do that in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Both of us are really starting to be confronted with what the status of the church is today, and religious faith and religious community on the other side of 2020.
Absolutely. Well, you've had 3 weekends under your belt now for reopening, and I'm sure it still feels a little awkward.
Very much so.
We're going to open the first Sunday of June, and it's feeling awkward already, and we haven't even done it yet. So, there's a lot about this reopening that probably won't be quite natural. But we're going to be navigating those icebergs along the way. But we did come upon an article that perhaps we all can benefit from. And it's entitled, for some pastors, "The past year was a sign from God. It was time to quit." A lot of it is built around some very fresh research by the Barna Group. The Barna Group came out with some fresh data indicating that some 30% of Protestant clergy across the United States are saying that they were fully ready to give it up during COVID. That's not surprising to us. And yet at the same time, it's sobering for us.
My anecdotal experience with colleagues of mine, friends of mine who do clergy work supports that research that Barna did. I think it's been truly a difficult time. I think pastors, priests, rabbis, I think that type of profession, there's always maybe a higher turnover rate in that profession just by default, by the nature of it. But certainly the 2020 season took it to a whole other level.
It did. It took it to a whole new level. These were stressors that were already in play, as you've mentioned. We've said it in other settings. COVID didn't so much create issues as it revealed issues. It revealed fissures and gaps that were already existing. I think the same is true in religious life, regardless of tradition. So we'll just take the religious life as a larger umbrella. One thing we know, according to Barna and others, and even some intramural type survey work that's done among religious groups and entities, is somewhere between 40 and 50% of all clergy spouses, even prior to COVID, desired for their clergy spouse to find something else to do in life.
Right.
So there was already that innate stress at home. The clergy spouse feeling the exhaustion, the stress, the strain, the trials that come with what it means to be clergy leaders, regardless of their religious traditions. And so I think COVID has unearthed that, pulled the Band-Aid back and exposed the fissure.
Mm-hmm.
David Kinnaman, the president of Barna, he indicated in this article that the past year, this COVID year, has been a crucible for pastors.
Mm.
Churches have become fragmented by political and social divides. They've become frayed. People's connectedness to local congregations is waning. The pandemic was a great revealer of the challenges churches face.
Mm. Yeah, and I think what the article brought to the surface, the three elements that were together bringing the heat, was the nature of the pandemic, and the politicization of the pandemic was
Yes.
one item. And then the racial unrest and the protesting and the debate around that came out of the many deaths at police hands was the second stressor upon congregations, and the third was the presidential election. And pastors and other clergy, we typically don't spend a lot of time dealing with party politics in the pulpit.
Yes.
We may talk about issues that we believe are important in the context of our faith tradition, but party politics we generally try to stay out of. And it was almost impossible not to even speak to party politics or be drug into party politics
Yes.
during this season. And then the opinions around how the police were doing their jobs, especially with people of color. Clergy could generally be in favor of racial equality, but now all of a sudden it seemed like this specific context was again dragging us into an uncomfortable area that we didn't know exactly how to navigate.
Yes.
And then that even the pandemic would turn into a political issue that others gave it up because of what they went through. It doesn't surprise me at all, because this took us into uncharted territory just on the issues challenging us, let alone trying to do faith community in a digital format. For many of us was the first time we had to do that. So and that's a whole separate issue than from the societal challenges that really came to bear in the last year.
Absolutely. Well, interestingly, that you mentioned those, the article uses the term trifecta as sort of that perfect storm. Have you ever seen that movie Perfect Storm? It's one of my favorites. But that perfect storm of those three elements coming together all at once that you've just mentioned, the pandemic, the 2020 election, and racial unrest, all of those coming together and creating a vortex, if you would, a super hurricane or a super tornadic experience that literally sucks the life out of everything that it touches. And you can no longer remain immune to these cultural and societal situations in the comfortable fabric of your congregation. No. These have penetrated through the walls of the churches, per se, and the walls of the mosque and the synagogues and the congregations where people gather. And you're having to deal with these. And clergy are calling for, their own personal timeouts. Finding the exit doors, because everything has become such a vitriolic attack. Even something as simple as wearing a mask.
Right.
I have mine in my office because I wear mine every day.
Right.
As a fully vaccinated person, I wear my mask every day because I live in a county that asks me to do so.
Right.
This mask became completely and totally politicized and galvanized
Yeah.
during the cycle of the pandemic. And when people are walking out of the churches that they have known and loved over a
Yeah.
mask rule, well, what does
Yeah.
that tell you? That tells you that you can no longer be inoculated, you can no longer be insular, you can no longer be isolated or insulated from these scenarios. But instead, if you don't find them, they will find you.
Well, and this is the evidence that marks the shift. I think the shift had happened before 2020, but the evidence is now clear. I think in the past, and Shane, you and I are too young to have to known or experienced anything related to what the church being church during the civil rights era and the Vietnam
Yes,
War. But you would look at those times and the era of Watergate with Nixon, those type of uh, militaristic, sociological, and presidential leadership challenges to our country.
yes.
I assume those were very turbulent times for our congregations, but I would also guess that back then, as turbulent as it was, and as much maybe turnover as there was that took place with members leaving or something, I don't think it's been anywhere like it is now. Because I think back then, religion and the congregation was still in a different place for people.
Mhm,
And you didn't quit the church, you didn't quit your local congregation
mhm,
um, because of politics.
mhm.
The general trend is people are leaving congregations, period. They're
Yes,
just checking out of religion altogether. But for those who still value religion, religion is an accessory to their political viewpoint
absolutely.
rather than the other way around.
You're
that
absolutely right.
is that is clearly where we are today. We are at religion as an accessory to politics
Mhm,
rather than politics as an accessory
mhm.
to religion.
That is a powerful statement and very descriptive, I think, accurately descriptive of where we are as a congregational culture in our larger country.
Yeah.
Um, and I think too, it goes back to something you mentioned earlier. There was a time, there was a season where party politics was not discussed from the platform or the pulpit.
Right.
People had their party affiliations. I can still remember as a kid growing up in rural Texas, rural agricultural communities. We had Democrats and Republicans and independents in the same congregation, on the same deacon board, singing in the same choirs. Um, and there might be prophetic issues that are proclaimed or preached from the pulpit, per se, but there was no sense of brand loyalty by which some candidate's flag was flown uh,
Right. That's right.
from any height. The only from any height of the pulpit or any height of the church organization or church structure or hierarchy. But that's changed.
Yeah.
That's changed. You're right. And I mean, we've seen it in real time. We've seen it in our own lives and in our own eyes, with our own eyes. We have seen the onslaught of red and blue states to red and blue churches.
That's right.
And you're right. People now pick their church, pick their congregation, pick their religion as an accessory to their presupposed political and philosophical positions already.
Yeah. We saw it here in LA, out in Sun Valley, John MacArthur's Grace Community Church. It was one of a handful of larger congregations who they took their stand specifically on being a church that would not enforce masks and would not enforce social distancing, and they took the challenge to the California Supreme Court to go all in and make a stand. They actually, I believe, attracted a number of people to their congregation who were against the mask mandate. And people were at that church to not wear a mask, not because they wanted to worship God in the Christian context, but it was a place where their politics were reinforced and in a tangible way by not wearing the mask. I think that's a telling sign of some of these churches who have had a higher profile, is that
Absolutely.
they really became identified with their ideology on the issue
Yeah.
more than being known as a place that fosters a stronger faith in God. It became issue driven.
And then those same congregations slash leaders, ministers, clergy, they become the bellwether. They become the watermark by which then other congregations and other clergy leaders are being evaluated,
That's right.
assessed, and appreciated or unappreciated, which then lends further into that arena of stress and strain and anxiety that clergy and ministry leaders are experiencing already.
Right. We just wanted, most of us just were willing to go along with what the county governance told us to do related to the pandemic. And for us, it wasn't a political issue. It was just following what our leaders in the social health world were telling us to do. And we're rolling along with that and ministering to our congregations. We weren't trying to turn it into a test of our faith or a test of our freedom. But because there were these leaders who made it into that, then all of a sudden, then members of our congregation are saying, well, look at what they're doing. And they seem to be standing for the truth or standing for freedom. Why aren't we doing? And then it turns into this stressor on the leadership of the congregation that none of us were trying to make a big deal about.
And that would be easy enough to navigate if the stress and strain of the ministry was not already at a fever pitch pre-COVID.
Right.
But we're talking about congregations of all stripes, shapes, colors, styles, traditions, geographies. Congregations in America pre-COVID were already places of great stress and strain. Congregations are in survival mode.
Yep.
And when I say congregations, I mean congregations and clergy.
Right.
We're already in survivor mode, already in that fight or flight syndrome. That was already pre-COVID. And then you add these stressors onto that. It's no wonder that clergy are saying, I'm out of here. Show me the door. Matter of fact, you don't even have to show me the door. I'll create the exit myself. You know, it's kind of like the salesman who went to that country church and saw they were open for an evening service, and he walked in, and they were really getting after it in that worship service, and he could tell that the intensity was building and building and building, to the point that finally it reached a fever pitch, and the preacher reached under the pulpit and pulled out a box, opened it, and it was full of venomous snakes. And he took those snakes and started handing them out to the people in the congregation. About that time, that salesman said to the usher, he said, "Sir, where is your back door?" And the usher said, "Sir, we ain't got a back door." And he said, "Well, where do you want one? Just tell me where you want one." The minister, the clergy are just saying, you know what? I'm going to create my own exit. I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Now, these are things we didn't sign up for. I mean, we got into this to serve people, to help people navigate their faith, and so much of it has been around the survival of our congregation.
Yes.
That just trying to survive is wearing. And then
Yes.
and then when all these issues are brought up, and where you could, and maybe in different times, say, well, we know some people may leave us because of the fact that we're still wearing masks, or they may leave if they sense the pastor is in the pocket of one politician or the other.
Right.
Well, but we'll see other people join our congregation. That's not the case anymore. Seeing people leave is us seeing the acceleration of the death of our church.
Yeah.
Every news cycle
Mhm.
has effect on the church, and you're wondering, when is the
Absolutely.
next controversy coming? When is the next thing
Yes.
that I'm going to lose a member over?
Yes. Every news cycle has something else to deal with. You're absolutely right. And you mentioned, interestingly enough, about our rootage, our anchoring, or if you would allow me to use the term, our calling as
Mm-hmm.
clergy. When and I think maybe any age, gender, orientation, tradition of clergy listening to to this podcast might could might could resonate with this that I'm saying. All of us are in the ministry because of some response deeply within us to a prompting, spiritual prompting, divine prompting,
Mm-hmm.
communal prompting,
Mm-hmm.
a prompting to proclaim truth out of our sacred text, out of our sacred beliefs and traditions, but to proclaim truth and to be the presence of the divine in the lives of others.
Mm-hmm.
Pastorally, as a shepherd, prophetically,
Mm-hmm.
as a prophet, uh, as a healer,
Yep.
as an advocate, or
Yep.
as a reconciler.
Yep.
You and I spent 15 minutes before this podcast began talking with one another about what each of us is having to do to get ready to reopen for worship in
Mm-hmm.
the area of digital technology, camera productions.
Yep.
Who watching this podcast went into ministry thinking that that would be our work?
I
We
did
become
not have a class
We've
on
become
that.
film editors. We've become content masters. We've become lighting specialists. And all the while, there is still that within us that is continuing to somehow respond to that prompting,
Yeah.
to that greater, deeper, and more abiding work as clergy, whatever that might mean in our own traditions. And yet at the same time, we would sometimes gladly find the exit.
Right. I think on the other hand, the these things have also tested clergy on keeping us centered on our calling, because I'll be honest with you, I have gotten very frustrated with people who disagree with me over the masking issue. And I've gotten very frustrated with the people who don't see the current struggle with police brutality against people of color the same way as I do. And I have been overwhelmed in perplexity and anger about people who were voting for a different candidate than I was. And I have been finding myself drawn into just being a mouthpiece for fighting on these issues,
Mm.
or for or against these candidates, um, and not focusing on my core calling, and or struggling to figure out if this issue is really core to my calling or not. And depending on the clergy that I talk to, some would say, well, on the presidential election, that issue is so core to your calling. You need to speak. You even need to tell people who to vote for in that election. I have clergy who told me that. And I've had clergy who said, no matter what, you stay out of it. And on the racial tensions of the past year, um, you know, people said you need to draw a line in the sand for your congregation and make a stand. And probably more than the other two issues for my congregation, on the racial issue, we did speak more clearly and forcibly on that probably than the other two. Um, and I felt like I came to a place where that was more closely tied. But again, that just describes the stress that we had, is us forgetting our calling in the midst of all this chaos, and trying to return there. I had to go through a whole recalibration in the second half of 2020 to kind of, I think, put myself back to where I needed to be, and centering myself in my calling as a pastor, because I felt like I had lost it over the summer. And so it's so not only has it been, we're dragged against our will into things we don't want to be involved in. Sometimes these are things we want to be involved in and maybe make the wrong choice on how involved to be with them, and how big a part of the ministry do they become. And so that was certainly been my struggle over the past year, and where I never actively pursued getting out of the ministry, but there were many days I would have been happy to be in some other line of work, for sure.
Well, first, thank you for your transparency. It's very refreshing to hear you or someone like yourself say those words. So thank you for your transparency. Secondly, your transparency resonates. It resonates with me, and it resonates with many, 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 many other clergy leaders out there. We all have felt that, experienced that, and gone through that. Regardless of our stances and positions in relationship to political leaders or party politics or whatever we've been facing as a nation, but just being able to say, yes, I have had to reconnect with my own sense of who I am. And this calling, prompting, this urging that is within me that I responded to so many years ago. I've had to reconnect with that during this season of COVID and political unrest and racial disharmony. I've had to reconnect. So thank you for that, because you just languaged what many of us would like to say, but we didn't know how to put it into words.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you know, a double-edged sword cuts both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are lay people, laity, watching this podcast who need to revisit their place in their congregation of faith, their house of worship, and in their relationship with their clergy leaders, and recognize that they bear great responsibility and they have great opportunity to enhance, strengthen, support, encourage, undergird, affirm their clergy leaders. And they have the same opportunity to destroy those leaders by what they say and how they say it.
So true.
And I think that there is a calling there for both clergy and laity. And I think that laity need to reassess. Just because you're a member, or just because you've been here all this time, or just because you're committed, or just because you're this or that, doesn't give you the privilege and the liberty to walk in and decimate people with your tongues or attitudes or your perspectives, and in particular to target your clergy and to target your clergy negatively. And this is part of this article. Clergy were saying, just because of various kinds of positions that we were taking, or various kinds of communications that we were making, we were being called everything from biblically illiterate to the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Who wants to continue to live in that arena?
No.
So laity bear great responsibility and have great opportunity. And it reminds us of the value of the ancient Hebraic scriptures that remind us that the power of words brings both life and death. So we can bless or curse with our words, our thoughts, and with our attitudes and the way we speak to each other and about one another. And clergy need to rediscover that. This idea that I'm a senior adult, or I'm over 65 and I can say whatever I want to say. That doesn't float in the household of faith. That doesn't float in a house of worship. That might float at your local coffee shop where you gather with your friends that think just like you think, but that doesn't float everywhere else.
Why I still believe in spiritual community is because I do believe that at its best, spiritual community ascribes dignity and honor to all people more than in any other place. In a faith community, when you're doing your job, people should be experiencing a sense of deep self-worth because they are created by God, and have a sense of purpose because they are called by God to be his ambassadors in their families, in their workplaces, in their neighborhoods. There should be an honoring and a respecting and a dignifying that takes place in congregations that is frankly lacking in so many other spheres of our world right now, and is frankly lacking too much within our congregations right now. And I think if we are to move back to a place of ascribing the inherent worth of people, Democrat or Republican, black or white, gay or straight, that no matter whom you're looking at a child of God. That is something that is desperately needed, so that the discourse in our society, the way we behave with each other, is elevated. I think this is one of the core missions of faith, is to take us to a higher place, not help us learn how to fake piety, but to create genuine love and respect for the other.
Absolutely.
That's what we're called to do. That's what the faith community, that's what you and I got into this for. We wanted to do that work, and that's what our congregations need to get back to.
And because I think our sacred texts and our sacred history, our sacred story is just that, Todd. It's exactly what you've said. It is the discovery and the living out of mutuality, of harmony at its highest levels. And you're right. We have lost the mutual sense of one another. It's either I, me, or mine, or it's you and yours, and there's no in between. And we have to rediscover the in between of mutuality and mutual faith and mutual respect and dignity with one another. So thank you for sharing that. And we are not, by any measure in this podcast, putting any negative light or negative pressure onto any clergy who feel like they can no longer do this for another day. This is not a shaming.
No.
It's not a humiliation. It's not any kind of a brutality stick by which we are beating our fellow clergy. If our fellow clergy sense that they're done, then they're done. And we respect that, because at the end of the day, each one of our clergy have been made in the image of the divine.
Yes.
And God has made each person to be whole, to be healthy and to be complete. And if that clergy can no longer be whole or healthy or complete in that clergy role, then for their own sake and sanity, and for the sake of the image in which they were made, they should take the steps to find the exit.
That's right.
And we will support them and encourage them all the way through.
That's right. The good thing about the calling of God is it's not limited to one position. And
No,
so those who felt called to be to who wanted to follow their calling by God as clergy, you can continue to follow God's calling
absolutely.
as any in whatever
Absolutely.
profession.
I resonate with that. If God allows it and gives me strength, if God allows me to live into retirement, whatever in the world that would be, I already anticipate ministry beyond the settled pastorate. I anticipate leadership beyond the settled pastorate.
Right.
I don't desire just to hang it up and quit. So you're right. It's not about losing our identity or losing the image in which we were created or losing the calling or the unction that has happened so deeply within us and that we have responded to by trust and faith. Has nothing to do with losing that.
Yeah.
It actually could have everything to do with enhancing it.
That's right.
And magnifying
Exactly
it
right.
and finding it and rediscovering it for a new era, for a new generation, for a new season.
That's right.
It could be that the best is still to come for these clergy who've said, I'm done.
Yep. Yep.
Absolutely. I'm sure you heard the story of the one spouse who woke up the other spouse and said, honey, it's time to get up. We need to get ready for church. And so the second spouse said to the first, I'm not going to church today. And the first spouse says, well, honey, we always go to church. You need to get up and get ready. The second spouse said to the first spouse, I'm not going back there anymore. Those people don't even like me. They never talk to me. They're not friendly to me. I'm done with them. And the first spouse said, honey, you have to get up. We have to go to church. Remember, you're the minister.
That's many morning.
Many a morning, many a morning.
Yes, sir. That's that joke is way too true.
Oh my!
But beyond all that, I think this is. I hope people hear our hearts on this. Just like I'm glad that you said, please, for the clergy, please hear our hearts. We're with you, whether you stay or you go. This is the calling of God, and I hope people hear our hearts. This is not the complaining pastor complaining about how hard our job is. We are two guys who are who know and have seen when church does good work in people's lives, and we've seen when church gets sidetracked and becomes at least a distraction, if not harmful, in what it's doing. And for you, Shane, and for me, it's longing for the congregation to be a place of finding that healing and finding that restoration.
And maybe too, in addition to what you're saying, it's that continual journey of discovery of how do we find each other as clergy? How do we walk with one another? Jesus of Nazareth had a very interesting methodology by which he always sent his followers out two at a time.
Yeah.
Never alone, but how much isolation and loneliness, how much insulation and insular capacity is the clergy feeling today? How can we be on this journey of rediscovering one another, finding each other on the road again, and walking shoulder to shoulder with one another again in ways that are fresh and invigorating and helpful and supportive and encouraging? How many times have you and I, Todd, been in these pastors' meetings, either in the Adventist tradition or the Baptist tradition, where it's really either bitching or bragging.
Yeah.
That's what the thing is for. You either complain, you either complain for an hour, or you sit there and listen to everybody brag on how great their life is and their church is for an hour. We're not talking about that. We're talking about rediscovering each other for this journey of life and faith that all of us are being called to travel. And how can we do that with one another post-COVID, coming out of COVID? How can we become more attuned to one another as clergy?
Thanks for listening. We'd love to get your feedback on today's conversation. Please email us at uncollarpodcast@gmail.com. You can get Uncollared anywhere you find your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can also watch our conversation on YouTube. And please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.